Good afternoon, everyone. Wow, okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tony DeBora. Among all of the hats I wear, I'm also Executive Director of the Johns Hopkins University Information Security Institute, and we're the focal point for cybersecurity research and education at Hopkins. It's my pleasure to be introducing our speaker and also let you know that we're co-sponsoring, the Information Security Institute is co-sponsoring this event with the SNF Agora Institute. For those of you who may not know, they are an academic center and public forum at Johns Hopkins University that's dedicated to improving and expanding civic engagement and informed, inclusive dialogue as the cornerstone of global democracy. A very interesting place. And I'm glad that they're here at Hopkins. All right. So our speaker tonight, this afternoon, and I'm really looking forward to his talk, Dr. Joseph Hatfield. He's an SNF Agora visiting fellow at Johns Hopkins University. He is a cybersecurity expert and retired naval intelligence officer with over 20 years experience in the field of military intelligence and cybersecurity. From 2015 through 2024, he served as a military professor at the United States Naval Academy, where he taught courses on the technical fundamentals of cybersecurity, cyber policy, and social engineering, or also known as human hacking. And with that, Joseph, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Tony. I really appreciate it. And thank you to everyone who's here. One thing I must say, since part of my introduction was my military background and my connection to the Naval Academy, I am here today purely on my personal capacity, and none of the views that I'm going to express today have anything at all to do with the views of the Department of Defense, the U.S. government, or the Department of Navy. So this is just me on my own. Today what we're going to do is, I've entitled this, What is the Dark Web? We've all heard about the dark web. We've seen it on television. We've seen people refer to it in commercials. You may have sat down at a commercial and had the commercials say, your data might be on the dark web. And to most people, that's sort of meaningless. It's sort of scary, but also quite meaningless. But today we're going to kind of explore the dark web. What is the dark web? I'm going to talk to you about some of the technical side of access to the dark web, as well as anonymous browsing. And then in addition, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the political and social issues surrounding the use of the dark web. And finally, we are going to turn off this PowerPoint and go ahead and get onto the dark web a bit. And I'm going to talk you through some websites. When I first started doing talks on the dark web, I was actually back at the Naval Academy as a professor, and the superintendent of the Naval Academy had seen a commercial that said that his data could be on the dark web. And so he came over to our department and asked, what does that mean and how does that work, et cetera. And they came to me and said, we'd like for you to present this to the superintendent. And so the first thing I did was I got on the phone to some contacts I had at the FBI and said, what are the rules of the road here? Because I don't want to get myself in trouble. And they talked me through this. And so nothing we're going to do today is going to be in any way illegal, but it will be for educational purposes only. And I will flag kind of the areas that we are at to talk about sort of the ethical and legal side of it as we go as well. Okay, so it's a very great honor to be here. And so let's get started. What is the dark web? An explanation and a live tour. Now, when most people think of the dark web, they think of something like this. So if you see this photograph here, this is actually a nice picture, came from a BBC article a few years ago. This is a case in China where you see a group of men lined up. All of them do not look particularly happy to be there. But the gentleman on the far left was a businessman in Beijing who had a business competitor. And unlike how I try to outcompete my business competitor, which is better prices for a better quality product, this gentleman decided to kill his competitor. And so he hired the person on his right, well, on our right, the person on his left, I guess. And he hired that person as a hitman and paid him some sum of money. I don't know the specifics on how much, but let's say it's 20,000, equivalent of 20,000 US dollars. The gentleman, I'll use our perspectives. The guy to the right of him decided that it was great collecting $20,000, but it's not so great actually having to kill someone. So he hired the person on the right, and he took a couple thousand off the top, and then the money became 18,000. And as you can imagine, this went all the way down until the guy on the far right didn't have enough money in the incentive structure to actually carry out the hit. So he went to the authorities and turned in the whole thing, and they used one by one and worked their way back. And now all they are there in court, facing a series of bad decisions. When most people think of the dark web, they think of something like this, where you contact a hitman or something on some nefarious website. And hopefully, if you are the person trying to purchase this sort of quote service, you don't end up in a picture like this. But that's what most people think when they think of the connotations of the term dark web. Or, and maybe even more famous case, they think of something like this. This is a screenshot of something that was called the Silk Road, which was an online dark web marketplace that had virtually no rules in terms of what consenting adults could buy and sell. And now the people who were going on the Silk Road did not verify their identity per se, except for the gentleman who owned the Silk Road, who ran that website, a gentleman by the name of Ross Ulbricht, actually did require that they provide their identification to him. So he kind of controlled that. But between the people that doing the purchasing and selling, they would not know. They would not know the identities of them. But Ross Ulbricht, who went by Dread Pirate Roberts, which was if you know the Princess Bride movie, that's maybe a throwback. So it's an age check for some of you in the audience. But I do know that movie, but that's what he went by, and he ran this quite successfully for a number of years until the FBI actually caught him and ended up putting him in prison. He actually got life in prison. And the reason why is because I don't know all the details about how each felony was, how many years he got, but effectively he was charged for attempted murder, for murder for hire, for some obviously drug-related charges, because every sale he was facilitating on the website and so on. A lot of people in the Free Ross community thought that was overly harsh punishment. And interestingly, President Trump just pardoned him. I think just a couple of weeks ago. So Mr. Ulbricht is now, he served a number of years and now he's out. I think it would be fascinating to talk to him today to find out to think about his perspective on his experience and all of that. But when people think of the dark web, they think of things like this: murder for hire, drug sites, anonymous browsing in order to do something nefarious. What I'd like to do in this talk is to challenge this idea. What counts as a dark website is actually context dependent. And what I want to do is use this talk and use some of the sites we're going to go to as a way to call into question the very concept of darkness as it is thought of on anonymous internet browsing. So hold this thesis in mind as we go through, and we'll circle back at the end, and it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts about it. But what I want to say is that the concept of dark is context dependent, because typically when we think of a dark website, we think of a website that is either unethical or illegal, and that or is it could be either or. It doesn't have to be both. Okay, so let's go ahead and move forward, and I'll give you a quick outline of what I'm going to cover. The first thing I want to do is I have to get to some definitions. We're going to talk about the surface web, we're going to talk about the deep web, and then we're going to talk about the dark web. Now, typically when people talk about definitions, it's like that's when the audience's eyes glaze over. Oh, they're going to go through some definitions. But in this particular talk, I think this is very crucial. So we're going to cover those definitions as our first topic. The second thing we're going to do is I'm going to explain to you how the normal internet works. because I need to provide a contrast to how browsing anonymously to a dark website will be different. It'll be quite different. Then we're going to talk about some privacy technologies that you may or may not be familiar with. And we're going to talk a little bit about this notion of freedom online. We're then going to talk about onion routing and something called the Tor browser, which I'm going to explain. And then finally, we will take a live tour of the dark web. So let's go ahead and get started into these definitions. So if you look on the right side, this nice iceberg kind of layout, you'll see, and on the left side is a corresponding at a, I decided to say it like at a typical organization, typical university, for example, like here at Johns Hopkins. On the right side, you'll see the top level is what we call the surface web. The surface web are the websites that you're familiar with. That's where you go to Google or Yahoo or Facebook or Netflix. These are the kind of things, the kind of websites that are available to anyone. And the surface web at a typical organization like a university are mostly open and free to anyone to browse. Occasionally, a university might block a few websites using a firewall. For example, if you have, when ChatGPT became available, some people were worried about students cheating using ChatGPT to write papers with, et cetera. Chegg and other code development websites that might be considered cheating. And so universities might block some of those, but for the most, maybe pornographic sites, maybe any sites that are seen potentially as problematic, an organization might block. But for the most part, that top layer, that surface web layer, is pretty much available to everyone. And these are the websites we're mostly familiar with. So typically when we're online, we are browsing on the surface web. Anything below that is going to be called the deep web. And the deep web requires some kind of login procedure, some kind of authentication procedure, a username and password. Sometimes it requires geofencing or geolocating. So if you have, for example, a service here at Johns Hopkins University, that's a database for students or whatever, but you have to be on an IP address that's an internal IP address, which means it's on the inside of a gateway router and it's being screened that way, or you have to VPN to one of those private IPs within that network. That would be considered the deep web, but you need some kind of access or some sort of get over some kind of login or geofencing. And then there are portions of that deep web that require some kind of Tor browsing, onion routing technology to get to, and that's an and, it is either unethical or unlawful, and that would be considered the dark web. Okay, so that's kind of a tripartite distinction between our web browsing. Most of us are very familiar with the first two. Very few of us understand or have any exposure to that last category. So we're going to get into the last category because the first two are well understood by all of us. So moving forward then. Yeah, please.
So I'm thinking about the amount of data. The surface web, by knowing about ChatGPT and things like that, we know that there are trillions of words of text. Are you saying that the rest of it is even more, or is that things other than text?
Any website that, and including data that's other than, it does not have to be text. Yeah, absolutely. So the question is, in terms of my 96%, now that there are these large language models are pulling from massive cloud data sets that are many times the size what they were even last year. And so the idea is that maybe the top level has grown in proportion, and that is true. And I think over time we might see that number even out. But still, with all of the data that people generate privately, you still have a tremendous amount more of that iceberg that's actually below the waterline. Very good, thank you, sir. Okay, so let's move into this discussion of how does the normal internet work. And I'm going to speak at a kind of a basic level. I can go into more depth if you'd like, but normally you have a device, whether it be an iPhone. I've got my iPhone here in my pocket. I'm going to have some kind of device or a laptop. I see people nowadays, we have watches, we've got all kinds of devices, people's hearing aids, they have got anything that can connect to some sort of device that can then connect online, or it can connect directly online. But you have some device, And that device is going to be talking to a web server. And the web server is going to be at some other location than where that device is. And these two devices, the web server and the iPhone or the Android phone or the laptop, whatever, are identified by something called an Internet Protocol address or an IP address. They are, as it were, individuated on the net, on that network layer as a host. And the term host is how we refer to computational devices when they're in the context of networking. And each of those hosts have an IP address. And when you connect, what happens is I open up a browser and I connect to Google, the Google server or wherever. And what happens is my operating system will exit my TCP/IP packets out of my phone into that web server. And that web server will be what we call listening in on a specific port that will be 443 if it's HTTPS connection. If it's that encrypted internet connection, will be port 443. So it's sitting there ready to host content on that port 443. Browsers are automatically configured to send HTTPS traffic through that port. And when it enters that port, it grabs the index.html file, brings it back, and it's rendered in my browser. And this sort of transactional activity is then recorded in a log that the web server can keep track of that says your phone at this time went to my web server, it recalled this particular file, goes back, it renders. And that kind of exchange, not only it allows for that kind of exchange, but it also identifies you. It identifies your device. And because IP addresses have a topography to them across the earth, it also identifies the location, rough location of that device. And so there's a protocol called DHCP, the Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol, that assigns IP addresses as you move if it's a dynamic device like my mobile phone. But the point is that each of these web servers can identify your phone or your laptop as you are moving across the world, and it can therefore identify you. So if you are trying to browse anonymously, this is not the way you want to go, because everything is pretty much able to be identified. And so that wouldn't be, if you tried to run some sort of nefarious website, then it would be caught very quickly. This principle of the ability to correlate transactions online from your phone to the web server or your device to that web server, this principle cybersecurity experts call non-repudiation. It's the pillar of non-repudiation. It's the ability to correlate activity on a network. And so that pillar is seen as a fundamental pillar of cybersecurity. In other words, one of the attributes, it could be 3 attributes or 5 attributes, depending upon the taxonomy you want to put forward in terms of confidentiality, integrity, and all of that. But using the 5 attribute model, that principle of non-repudiation is exactly what prevents me from browsing anonymously in a normal circumstance. So what that means then, if I'm going to get on the dark web, I need to break the principle of non-repudiation. And that's what the Tor browser does. And I'll explain how that works here in a second. So this is the normal internet. Now, there are ways to try to be more anonymous online. These are privacy technologies. You may be familiar with some of them. So for example, you may have experienced a virtual private network, a VPN. I'm sure at Johns Hopkins they have VPN technology. And what a VPN does is it uses encryption to create an encrypted tunnel between a device and some device, let's say here on campus. And so I'm at home, down in Southern Maryland, let's say, and I create a VPN connection to a computer here on the campus. And what happens is the TCP/IP packets that are going to that web server, that Google server, are going to be traceable back to the device here on campus, but they are not going to be traceable back to my device. That it's as if I am browsing from the device here on campus. And so all the TCP/IP packets, which are those little bits of data that are being sent, are going to be encrypted. And so that's a very secure thing to do. If you're ever if you're in an airport or in public Wi-Fi scenario and you want to do banking or whatever, you don't want people around you to be able to grab those packets out of the thin air or examine any of where you're browsing. You definitely want to use a VPN before you do any of that. Don't just rely on HTTPS. So that's one technology, and most people are pretty familiar with that. Moving down, you've got another group of technologies. For example, you can have searching that does not necessarily record your search terms. So we all know that Google is using our search data, using our search terms in order to generate ads. They're trying to they sell advertisements effectively, and they also use that to build massive amounts of data in order to use large language models and that sort of thing. Well, there are other browsers out there, there are other search engines out there like DuckDuckGo that does not have that model. Now, I will say, in other words, they do not mine your inputs for that sort of purpose. Now, I'm the first to admit that DuckDuckGo is not as good as Google. It does not produce the results that Google does. I use DuckDuckGo all the time. And when we get to the Tor browser, that is the default search engine on Tor. But I admit that it's not quite as good. But there's where a trade-off is between privacy and your capability of your web search. Finally, we'll move down to end-to-end encryption services, and people are starting to become quite aware of these. So Signal, WhatsApp, these kinds of services. Proton Mail is another one. And end-to-end encryption services are using RSA encryption. I'll explain what RSA encryption is, or asymmetric encryption, here in just a second. But they're using it in such a way that no one, not even the company, are able to decrypt the data. In fact, I had a Proton Mail account and I forgot the password, and I tried a bunch of iterations, and effectively they just had to blast the whole thing. There was no, here, let me, they're storing my hash and I have to go recall that. They're not doing any of it. I had to restart over fresh, and that's when I stopped using Proton Mail because I had screwed that up. But it's very secure. And there are some way, there have been problems. WhatsApp has had some problems with maintaining its end-to-end encryption capability, but typically the way around these tend to be human factor, those human hacking attacks, not so much the actual encryption. The encryption is solid, but there are some hacking ways around that. But these are privacy technologies. Now, the reason why I bring these up in a conversation about the dark web is because we all have reasons why we want to keep our communication private. And I like to bring this up because there is this thought that I sometimes get from people that say, oh, you want to browse anonymously on the dark web or on any web. You want to use Tor. You want to use onion routing. What are you trying to hide? That's the idea. And what they're doing is they are assuming that the default needs to be that other people should have access to your data, to what you're doing. And then if you do not want that, suddenly the burden of proof is on you to justify that. I think that that's entirely the wrong way around. I think that the default needs to be anonymity. And then if someone wants access to my data, then they have to justify it. And sometimes that justification is very easy to give. And the analogy I like to use is showering. I shower by myself. I lock the door. If someone wants access to the bathroom while I am showering, they have to justify why it is that they can come into the bathroom while I'm showering. I don't have to justify that. Now, we can think of justification. If you live with an elderly parent, for example, who might fall and you need access to come help them, then it's justified to keep that door unlocked. But the burden of proof is on the individual wanting to access that bathroom, not on the person that's wanting privacy. I think online privacy is the default, and anyone who wants access to that has to justify it. We have ways to do that. For example, my friends at the Federal Bureau of Investigation, if they can get a warrant through through a court order because they've justified, they know that there's something bad happening, they can do that, and therefore that is justified. But this idea of what are you trying to hide, as if someone who wants to use Tor or some browsing, anonymous browsing, as if they are in need of justification, I find that to be entirely backwards. Yes, ma'am, I'm sorry.
Geolocation. So, for example, if I want to access French television, or Netflix has programs available on their Great Britain site that aren't available here, so there are apparently ways that you could get a VPN that make it seem like that's where you are, so that you can access movies.
Yes, exactly. And I'm certainly not advocating violating any user rights on the BBC or Netflix or whatever. But yes, a VPN does allow you to appear to that web server as if you are in the location of that IP address of that faraway computer that you have created that end-to-end encrypted tunnel into. So yes, if you are in Baltimore and you did a VPN to London, and then you were to go to the London Netflix server, it's going to see that as a London-based computer, and it will then serve London UK-based content to that device. Absolutely, yeah. So that is one thing that people do. Absolutely, that can be a feature, and if it's part of the company's user policy, that's great. In some cases, it's not part of the user policy, in which case that would not be. Yeah, right. But people, not that people don't do it, but that's effectively it. Yeah, exactly. So we're gonna kind of set aside this concern that people have about privacy, because we want to be private and we don't have to justify that. Okay. Now that doesn't justify doing bad things privately. Of course, bad things are bad by definition. That's a tautology, right? But this idea that it's somehow inherently bad to have an anonymity browsing, I think, is what needs to be called into question. Okay, so let's go ahead and move forward a little bit. I have to get into a little bit of arithmetic here. Hopefully this doesn't freak anybody out, but I want to talk a little bit about how RSA encryption works. RSA encryption is also called asymmetric encryption. So I have to take you back to your middle school days, or I went to Kansas public school, so it was probably high school for me. But back to your middle school days, and you learned about this idea of prime factorization. And prime factorization, where you take a big number like 72 and you start to break it down into its prime numbers, right? And it turns out that 72 is, I have it up here, 2 times 2 times 2 times 3 times 3, right? Do you remember doing that, the little tree when you were a kid? Okay, well, it turns out that it turns out that very high numbers of primes, very, very high, large prime numbers. For example, I've given you one down here. I won't even try to read it, but that prime, those two numbers at the bottom there, 422 million or whatever it is, that is also a prime number, but it's just extremely high. And it turns out that human beings can, through various mathematical methods, discover large prime numbers, and computers, for a variety of technical reasons, find that solution to be difficult, at least normal computers that are not quantum computers. This is the concern people have about quantum, is that they can do this instantaneously. But for right now, when we are not talking about quantum computation, this is easy for humans to do, difficult for computers to do. And what the modern encryption technology, ever since the 1970s, when the British GCHQ actually discovered this before RSA, anyways, this is the basis of all of our modern internet encryption, effectively. And so what we're going to do is we're going to use the fact that human beings can come up with large prime numbers in a way that computers cannot, in order to perform some interesting arithmetic that I've shown here. We don't necessarily have to walk our way through it, but effectively what you're going to end up doing is creating two what we call encryption keys. And a key is a nice metaphor, because I unlock a door and I can lock a door. An encrypted key can encrypt data, and then you use the key to decrypt the data. You transform it really from one binary state to another, but one makes a lot of sense to us through an ASCII table or one of these translation methods, and the other one makes no sense at all. And so by doing that, this is how we actually transform the encryption. But effectively what happens is you've got a public key and a private key, and the public key is reflected in two integers, E and N. Private key is two integers as well, D and N. And you notice that N is common between both keys. And I'll explain the keys here in a second. But the value of N is selected such that N equals P times Q, where P and Q are both prime numbers. So that's where those two prime numbers come in. If you know E and N, you can kind of see here the arithmetic, you can kind of see the way it's coming together. Then you found the factorization of N into P and Q, and therefore you can compute D. What this means in common sense terms is that we've got two encryption keys. One is going to be called a public key. The other one's going to be called a private key. The public key, your browser will advertise to anyone because it is public. When you send that HTTPS GET request to that server, one of the pieces of data that you are sending to that server is your public key. The private key is kept private and is never shared at all. It is never shared. It is a private key. And what your device, that mathematical arithmetic relationship between those two, what that means is that anything that is encrypted with one of those keys can only be decrypted with the other. So this is a key pair. I'll say that one more time because that's the clincher. And this is what's going to help you understand how Tor browser works and how anonymous browsing can be acquired. So there are two keys. They've got some mathematics behind it. It's a little arithmetic. But these two encryption keys are held by your device, and the public key is sent along with your web traffic, and it's shared to anyone. And your private key is never shared to any device. And those two keys are mathematically related, arithmetically related, in fact, such that anything that is encrypted using one of those keys can only be decrypted using the other of those keys. Got it? Hopefully that makes a little bit of sense. They're a key pair. And I've got a little picture there. You see the key, the green and the red key, and they're kind of married up to each other because they're related in that arithmetical way. Okay, so once we've got these key pairs, you have to realize that every single device that is on the internet will have a public and a private key. And that becomes critical for how we can browse anonymously. So let me get into how the Tor browser works. So when I say Tor, that's actually an acronym, despite the fact that we always spell the O and the R as a lowercase. But it's an acronym that stands for the Onion Router. And it literally is talking about an onion. And I'll explain what that means here in a second, because it has to do with how it's encrypted. So the Onion Router was first developed by the United States Naval Research Lab. It was designed for the purpose of anonymous communication for intelligence, naval intelligence, and other types of government-related communication. Today, the covert communication techniques have advanced beyond this, but the Tor technique is now in a nonprofit space, and academics and other privacy enthusiasts maintain it through Tor.org. And when you go and you download the Tor browser, you literally just go to Tor.org and download the browser. It's a browser just like Firefox. It's a browser just like Chrome. It's about a browser just like any of these other browsers that you may or may not have heard of. I always like throwing Iceweasel into it because nobody's ever heard of it. It makes me sound like I'm advanced or something, but Iceweasel, check it out. But anyways, so these browsers, so you download the Tor browser. And the very first thing when you download this browser, what happens is it will say in the download process, it'll say, would you like to just be a user of Tor? Or would you also like to be a Tor node? And what a Tor node means is that you are volunteering your device for that to have Tor traffic routing through your device. Are you going to be a node in this Tor network? And there are thousands and thousands of these relays within the Tor network. Now, you might ask yourself, well, why am I, this is a very much a free rider problem, by the way, because why would I allow myself to be, I just want to use it, but I don't want to contribute to the network. But it turns out that the more Tor nodes you have in the network, the more secure the system is. And you'll see why in just a second. So you download the Tor browser, and again, that browser is going to have public key and a private key. And when you then access a website using the Tor browser, what happens is the Tor browser will have effectively, I'm going to simplify this a little bit, but it'll have effectively a library that knows the public keys of any of these nodes that are out there on this network. And it's going to build a circuit. It's going to go back and grab the public keys, those encryption keys that are made public by any of those devices. It's going to grab 3 of those public keys. It'll first grab because the circuit is going to take it's going to take 3 different hops before it gets to the actual destination. And the first key that it grabs is the final circuit's public key. Then it grabs the second circuit's public key, and finally the most proximal, which is called the guard's public key. And it brings it back, and then when it goes to start that initial transaction online, it takes those TCP/IP packets and it encrypts the data. So it encrypts the destination, where it wants to go, all of that, first using the outgoing, the final public key of that circuit. It encrypts that, which mathematically transforms the data inside it to something that you would need the private key of that device in order to see. And then it encrypts that with the middle relay's public key. And then again, you see the onion being built? It encrypts it with the initial public key. So you've got encrypted, 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 but it's in reverse order. Encrypted first with the final relay. You can see up there my little, first it with this exit relay, then with the middle relay, and finally with that entry guard. That TCP/IP packet then gets sent to the entry guard. And here's what's fascinating about this. The way that the designers, the Naval Research Lab, developed this, they wanted to browse anonymously. And they figured out that what you can do by splitting your browsing traffic into these multiple steps, you do the following. Any browsing session, you need who is doing the browsing, and you need to know where you're browsing to. I'm Joe Hatfield. I'm going to browse to Google. I need both of those pieces of information. By splitting it up into 3 separate nodes, what it does is the nodes that know who is doing the browsing don't know where you're browsing to. And the nodes that know where you're browsing to don't know who's doing the browsing. So by splitting up those 2 pieces of data, which are both needed for the transaction online, it keeps the user anonymous. Does that make sense? So the nodes that don't know who you are, they know where you're going. The nodes that know, oh, this is where this person's going, they do not know who you are. So let's walk through this. And we're going to do it live too. So there I am on my Tor client. I've built my onion. So I've got the data that I need, which is my destination address and all of that. And I've encrypted it first with that exit relay. That's the bottom of the onion. That's the inner part of the onion. I've encrypted it. I then encrypt it again with that little middle relay. And then I finally encrypt it with that entry guard. Then that onion that I've built gets sent to that guard. That guard uses its private key to unwrap the top layer of the onion and reveal nothing but what the next destination the address is. Now, let me ask you this to see if you're following. Does that entry guard know who you are? Yes, exactly. All right, you guys are getting it. Does it know where you're going? No, it does not know where you're going. Okay, so this thing then goes to that middle relay. The middle relay then takes its private key, unwraps the next layer of the onion. Now that middle relay, does it know who you are? No. Does it know where you're going? No. It's like super stupid. It's the dumbest relay of all of them, right? It just knows I got it from over here and I'll send it over here. Then it gets sent over to the exit relay. The exit relay again takes its private key, decrypts it, and now does it know who you are? No. Does it know where you're browsing? Yes. And a similar process happens. I've simplified it a little bit. That destination is actually kind of a rendezvous point because the web server is doing the same thing, and both meet because we want to keep the location and identity of the web server private as well. But the idea is that you are meeting in the middle and you're doing that exchange, and that's what's needed for anonymous browsing. So that's how the Tor browser effectively works. It's extremely clever. Like most ideas, the hard part is thinking of it. But once you hear it, it's like, oh yeah, that's a good way to do it. That's a smart way to do it. And it is extremely effective. Okay, so that is how the Tor browser works. Now, I said earlier that darkness is context dependent. So if you were the reason why we here in the United States think of the dark web as hitmen for hire, or we think of things like drug websites or gun websites, is because we have the US Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And we can go to the New York Times without any penalty. We can go to Twitter or any other place online on that surface web without, we may not like what we find there, but we can certainly go there without any problem. But let me tell you this, if you are in China, for example, and you are behind the Great Firewall, the Golden Shield Project, which is the most sophisticated TCP/IP deep packet inspection regime in the world. The Chinese government is extremely good at deep packet inspection, at packet filtering, and keeping people off of websites like Twitter or the New York Times or anything that the Chinese Communist Party is not wanting inside their internet. Then in that context, something like the New York Times, would that be an illegal or an unethical place to go? Yes, it would be maybe not unethical, but certainly illegal. And so that would be constituted as a dark website. We would be, so the notion of darkness is context dependent. One of the reasons why the Tor.org organization continues to develop Tor is to give access to people who do not have free anonymous browsing capability. So yes, it empowers people to sell guns and drugs and things, but it also empowers people to be able to enjoy a freedom of speech that they may not enjoy otherwise. Make sense? So the notion of darkness is context dependent. I think that's a very important thing to remember rather than just take for granted the idea that, take for granted the freedoms that we enjoy here in the United States. Okay, and there's a couple, Google, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, New York Times, these kinds of websites are simply not available. That doesn't mean, though, I've got a couple, there's actually a generational, political scientists have measured a generational attitude shift simply because of data availability. In China, for example, people's memories of social revolutions and is all being shaped by their information environment. I think in the United States, we're very aware of how information and the information environment can very much change people's attitudes. And this is happening in China. The New York Times just ran this article talking about a lot of data before a lot of this got shut down by the Golden Shield Project, a lot of this data was still available online, and it's being taken away. And so this is affecting an entire generation of Chinese citizens who are not growing up with that kind of information available. So Now, of course, the Chinese Communist Party would justify it in many different ways, but that's just something to think about when you think about the notion of darkness. There are ways in which the Chinese citizens are able to get around the Great Firewall. And effectively what has happened is the Tor nodes themselves are blocked by the Ministry of Public Security in China. But that doesn't mean they can't try to get around it, citizens getting around it. And they can get around it. When they download the Tor browser, they can use these bridges, these Tor bridges, where you can take a normal browser and you can point the browser instead of port 80 for HTTP or port 443 for HTTPS, they can port it to they can send the TCP/IP packets to a server that is a relay server that is on the other side of the Great Firewall that is listening in on a randomized port that the MPS doesn't know about. And then you can bridge from your device to that external port and then get on the Tor network and browse using Tor. So that's effectively how, and that only lasts insofar as the authorities don't find that bridge. And once they find the bridge, they shut that down. But then through word of mouth and other, other means, you can bridge again. And so there's this cat and mouse game that goes on. And it's not just China, any authoritarian regime that has these kinds of designs about controlling their local information space. This is the cat and mouse game that goes on behind those kinds of systems. Okay. So let me just go through here and we're done with our PowerPoint. I thought that was really clever with the colors there. I don't know, Tor. So let's go ahead and fire up the Tor browser. So I'm going to minimize this. All right. And you'll see here on my desktop that this is Tor browser. It's just a browser like anything else. You see the clever little onion icon. So I've already downloaded it from tor.org. It asked me if I want to connect to Tor. You'll notice that when I opened it up, it did not automatically maximize to my screen. The reason why it does, I'm going to go ahead and maximize it just because I'm giving a presentation and I want you guys to see the whole thing. But the reason why that matters is because of something called fingerprinting. When you send your data to a web server, part of the information that's being sent by your browser is the screen resolution of the device you're on. And that can be used to identify you, even though you might think, well, how many millions of these types of devices are out there? But that data in conjunction with other data can potentially identify you. So if you're ultimately trying to be anonymous, you would not maximize your browser window because that's just one little piece of information. But I'm going to go ahead and do it. Yes, ma'am. That's a good question. So the question is, did I pre-select DuckDuckGo rather than Google or whatever? But the answer is on Tor, DuckDuckGo is the default. So I did not pre-select. That's a good question because they're going to default to anonymous related searching. So here I am, and I've connected to the Tor network. Now you'll notice up here in the top of my browser. Well, I've got for this demonstration, I've gone ahead and saved some bookmarks into my browser. But a lot of people, they will have these written down, or they will have a file, a notepad file or something on their desktop. But anyways, you'll notice that I've got no information up here. But when I go ahead and click, I'm going to click on the New York Times website. Notice that this is just NewYorkTimes.com. It's just the regular old New York Times. And I click on that. You'll notice that suddenly this little icon appears. And what's happening is it's showing me the circuit. And you'll notice that it's switched about 3 times. Now it's settled on a circuit. So I am browsing from, in this case, Baltimore. It is then building that circuit. It is first taking me to Germany. It's then taking me, it switched again, to Germany, and now Germany again. But you see that it's building that circuit, and the reason why it keeps flipping back and forth is because the Tor browser tries to measure 2 things. It tries to, the more random the circuit, the more secure it is, but it also becomes latent. There's some latency issues. So they tries to balance between latency and proximity to wherever that destination server is. Now, luckily for me, the New York Times has servers all over the place, even in Russia. And so I'm actually accessing the New York Times website via an exit node that is currently in Russia. I keep saying that, but it might switch on me. So that's affected what's happened. Yeah. Yeah. So the question is, could someone in Russia use that to browse the US version? And the answer is absolutely yes. That's right. Yep, you can. You could do it in Beijing as well. Now, getting to Tor.org to download the Tor browser to do this is problematic unless you bridge out of the Golden Shield Project firewall. But once you do that and you get the browser, you could do it. Absolutely. Yep. This is not just a US thing. Okay, so here I am, and I'm on the New York Times website. Now, I want to show you something. Right here, here's some human behavior. If I accept cookies, then I'm potentially increasing my vulnerability online. So I'm going to go ahead and just reject all of those. But you can see that certain human factor-related decisions that I'm making can increase or decrease my vulnerability online in terms of anonymity. So what I'm going to do is I'm showing that I can browse normal traffic, normal websites using the Onion router. I do not need to only go to special websites. But it just so happens that the New York Times runs a .onion website. You'll notice that the browser is signaling saying, are you sure you want to be on the .com website? We can meet you at the rendezvous point in a Tor in a Tor circuit, is what it's telling me. They do that. Very good. So the question is, why do they do that? They do that because if you are in Beijing, and you want to browse a dark website like the New York Times, you don't want to go to newyorktimes.com. You want to go to the Onion site. Absolutely. So they are willing to do that. So what happens is these websites like the New York Times, they do what's called mirroring. They have a mirrored server that anytime they update a story to one website, it mirrors to their .onion website. Their .onion website is not locatable because of this RSA encryption. It's going to be there to rendezvous anyone who is using the Tor browser from wherever they're at. Yeah, these services do this as a service it's like a public service precisely in order to get their information into places where people are trying to prevent them. And it was funny. I was at the BBC headquarters in London, and a friend of mine who's a reporter there. I said, hey, where's your, can I talk to somebody here who runs your guys' Onion service? And she looked at me and says, what, we have an Onion service? We had no idea, even though she's part of BBC on television and so on. But yeah, the BBC as well has an Onion service. So if you go to the Onion site, the first thing you'll notice is that the URL, that web address at the top looks very different than it did, right? It's not newyorktimes.com. It's now this strange looking set of symbols, .onion, which is, it is on the Onion domain. This is hitting a rendezvous point. In this case, the rendezvous point is in Lithuania. Okay, so it's being served to me in Lithuania. The BBC as well also has a .onion site that you can go to, and there it is. And so once again, this is being served on the Onion network. Yes, sir.
Someone else who wants to know where you're visiting, they know that you're using Tor browser, so they could they track the map that the Tor browser is using? Could they go back to the server that you're accessing?
Okay, so the question is, if you're on the .onion, if you have a circuit running to that .onion rendezvous point, and can they trace it? And the answer is no. There are weaknesses in the Tor network. But in general, speaking in general, the answer is no. They are not able to trace it back. They are not able to trace it back. Yes. Excellent question. How do you find these .onion sites? Well, I will say this, that some normal websites like NewYorkTimes.com will say, hey, by the way, we have a .onion. They will advertise that. We're going to, here in a second, get to some dark websites from the perspective of people in the United States. So dark, what we would normally call a dark website. And those are often listed on the regular internet, on lists, or there are some directories on the dark web that will try to list them. Now, of course, what's happening, speaking of cat and mouse game, is the minute you list one, you're listing it for potential users, but you're also listing it for law enforcement and anybody else. And so usually what will happen is they'll list it and then it'll say, when did we last check to see this is still available? It's still up and not being taken down. So it basically is a hodgepodge, and you have hit an exact key issue. So every time I give a talk like this, usually about an hour or two before, I go through all my links to make sure they're still up and running, because sometimes they are not. Especially things like drug marketplaces and things, they are not running because they've been identified or attacked, or something like a DDoS attack is being administered on that. And I'll explain what a DDoS attack is here in a second. Yeah. So the onion, yeah. So the observation was I've never seen an onion site. You will only see an onion site if you're using the Tor browser or an onion routing services. Yeah, that's right. So if you haven't done that, then you won't see it, right? Okay, so let's go ahead, and I want to move to. We'll start moving to the right here on my save, and we'll start to get deeper into what I would consider kind of the dark web. So the CIA, believe it or not, has a dark website, has a .onion website. Now, why would the CIA have a .onion website? Well, because they want to be able to have people be able to reach out to them, right? They want people to be able to volunteer information, say, hey, I've got some information. I'd like to help the United States. How do I get in contact with you, et cetera? Now, if you go to the CIA.gov website, they will and say, hey, I'd like to contact you. They are going to say, okay, here are some instructions on how to do this. Download the Tor browser, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I am accessing the CIA's already .onion site, so they're not saying you need to do this because you're already there. And if I were someone who wanted to work with the CIA, if I were I could just go straight to this online form, and I could contact the CIA online, and I could actually just go in and provide my contact info directly. Whereas if you were on the regular website, they would have to give instructions on how to get to this, and so on. So that's that. Similar to that, news organizations like tips from whistleblowers. They like tips from insiders. They like tips from people like that. Oh, I forgot to show the circuit. This one is Germany, Netherlands, Austria. Lots of European locations today. All right, so Secure Drop. These are organizations that are interested in having if you're a whistleblower, if you are someone within government who wants to anonymously provide information, they provide these services. You see the Washington Post, you see Der Spiegel, and these kinds of places. So again, and you can imagine some of this could be done for good reasons, but people could also, I think of someone like Edward Snowden, who drops things that probably should not have been given to, at least from my perspective, should not have been given to newspapers and things. And so like any technology, things can be delivered that is positive and it's useful, and a whistleblower is really a whistleblower, or it could be irresponsibly dumped to a news site who then uses careless judgment to publish. Yeah, sure.
For the Washington Post, the New York Times, to browse it, are subscriptions kind of either or? Are they? Can you use a subscription, or doesn't that give away your?
Absolutely. So this is a very good, very, very good question. So the question is, if I'm browsing the Washington Post on a .onion site, how do I how do I do that if they're blocking, because I need a subscription to see the content? And the answer is it works the exact same way on the .onion site as it does. So you're going to get that 10 a month before I have to buy. And then if I want to go past that, I have to put my username and password in. And as you mentioned, that is a human behavior that certainly would give away what you are doing. So for example, I have a Wall Street Journal account, but if I was browsing it on, which I normally just browse it in the normal app, but if I were to go through Tor and to browse it, I think I reach a 5 or 10 article limit in a month. If I want to go further and read that next article, then I'm going to have to log in. But the minute I do that, it's going to identify me. Now, they may not know the IP address that I'm originally using because I'm going through this Tor, but they know that it's me, or at least someone with my credentials. So I wouldn't do that unless I were do that. Now the issue is though, is a lot of time those browsing sessions are tracked by those sites by IP address. So Tor can, because it's flipping those a lot, you can kind of reset your 10 limit or whatever. So yeah. Yeah, Signal. So when the observation was that on Blue Sky and other places, there are investigative journalists who are saying, if you have information you want to contact me, here's my Signal. Here, you can use Signal, and that's very true. That's different than the .onion. That goes back to that end-to-end encrypted service. Which is very good, but the content of the data is going to be encrypted, not necessarily the location of the person that's doing the data transfer. What Tor is doing is it's hiding your identity. So yeah, these are great questions. I love the engagement. Okay, so now I'm going to move a little further in, and here's an example of to your question of the how do I get these dark websites? Darkfail is one of those aggregate sites that tries to keep a listing of some of these, and it'll say like, is it offline? Is it online? This is offline, for example, this Bohemia Market, which I used to be able to go to and to show people, but it looks like it's offline. So they're telling you, hey, here's the URL we had, but now it's offline. But here's an example of kind of a list of sites that you can find. There are also some web searching kind of sites, but these are fairly unreliable. But you can come in here and you could type in, for example, guns. Actually, I keep on forgetting to show you so here's Germany, Finland, and France. We're on the East Coast, so that doesn't really surprise me. But there you go. It's going to just type in, it's going to try to find, but it'll find, some, like, for example, black market guns, which we have. Actually, I've got that one over here. So I'm going to go ahead and go to that. So now I'm at black market guns. Now we're truly in what we would call the dark web, right? So black market guns, which we're talking about the illegal sale of weapons. There's your RPG for $1,500, right? Now, is it illegal to, and this is what I was asking my FBI friends, is it illegal to go and see, oh my gosh, there's a $1,500 for an RPG? No, it's illegal to buy an RPG. I'm not going to purchase this RPG, right? The only area that is very, very, very problematic is pornography. And the reason why is because even rendering it in your browser can cache an image on your computer. And if it is of a minor or something really terrible, you now have effectively child pornography on your computer. So you'll notice that I'm not going anywhere near anything like that, nor will I ever. Because that's not only is that not something that I want to see, I've got 2 daughters. I don't want to, but also because I don't want to risk crossing that line legally and ethically. So, but in this case, people are selling this equipment, and if someone were to go on and purchase it, then they would cross that line, and they would be illegal. But we're not going to do anything like that today, and this is for educational purposes. I'm going to get your question and then yours. Yeah. I'm going to have to say I just don't know. So it's a really good hypothesis. You know, I've seen arguments both ways on that, but I do not know. I do not know the answer to that on whether or not those kinds of bans will increase or decrease. It's kind of like the arguments in favor of legalization of drugs or prostitution, and then they make predictions on whether or not that will increase or decrease and I simply I am not familiar enough with the social science to know whether or not that would work. So I'm sorry, I have to say I just don't know the answer to that. It is a very difficult question. That's outside of my area of expertise, unfortunately. Yes, sir. Yes, other website browsers would not be able to access this .onion URL. The URL is that particular web server is feeding content to a rendezvous point that is only reachable using onion routing. So that was a good question. The question was, I'm sorry, I should have restated it. The question was, can you get to this type of website using a regular browser? And the answer is no, because it's specifically looking for that Tor circuit that's using that RSA encryption to meet at a rendezvous point. So, okay. Now, if the federal government, if they're, let's say they're trying to stop this sort of thing, then what they can do, obviously they can try to stop on the demand side, and they can stop on the supply side. The supply side, they can try to find who's running this website and shut them down. If they can't find who's running it and shut it down, then they're kind of left to just something called a DDoS attack, which is a distributed denial of service attack, which is when you get a whole bunch of virtual machines or devices that fire up a browser and just start firing TCP/IP packets at this IP address in order to overload it with requests for information, so that the individual who's actually trying to browse this site can't that legitimate transaction gets lost in the overall data. It basically just overwhelms the website. And some of the hardest, if you guys ever been on a website where there's a captcha, we have to solve a little captcha. Dark web captchas are the hardest captchas, precisely because you typically have a lot of people just DDoSing that site because they don't know how else to get access to it. Now, the fact that this black market guns is still up and running leads me to believe that probably if the feds or anybody else are targeting this, they are not trying to target just by denying it. They're trying to infiltrate it. And that's what happened to Ross Ulbricht in the Silk Road. He had some drug websites going, et cetera. And instead of just DDoSing the site and rendering it obsolete, what the FBI did was they actually infiltrated the website. They actually used human-based kind of espionage techniques to get Ross to think one of the users was actually a friend. And at one point, the FBI was actually given the sysadmin login capability that Ross, as the system administrator, was actually using. That's how much he trusted one of these users. Turned out the user was an FBI agent. So that was old-fashioned police work, quite commendable. Okay, so this is an example of that. There are stock insider trading type of sites that are out there. Again, insider trading is illegal. And that would be people who have information that they could sell and they could short a stock or gain or whatever. And so that's Germany, Netherlands, and there they are. There are, Dread is it's like a Reddit, but it's completely uncensored and completely unmoderated. So some Reddit discussions would not be allowed on Reddit. This is an example of a site that basically has no rules when it comes to that. Yeah. Well, it's not that they let it keep going. I mean, you try to stop it like any sort of illegal activity. But yeah, I'm not familiar with how strongly they're going against this particular site or not. But yeah. Again, Dread is an example of a site that is like Reddit, but without any kind of rules. Pirate Bay is an example of a website for torrenting or the sharing of files effectively illegally, because these should be copyrighted, but yet people who are pirating software and so on, there they are, and they can search and do all kinds of that sort of thing. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. That's a very good question. Yeah, so the question is downloading something from the Tor browser, does that risk breaking your anonymity? And in most cases, the answer is no. In most cases, no. But there are a lot of other risks involved. So for example, if I were a law enforcement or an intelligence organization and I wanted to identify you, then I would host something for you to download that has a beacon that allows me to identify you upon downloading. And so then I could just activate the beacon, I'd know your original IP address, right? There are questions all the time as how many of these sites are sting operations and how many of them are legitimate, right? And really it's word of mouth. People say, hey, I bought drugs and they really did come to my house. And it's the user experience. Hacking services, this is near and dear to my heart as a cyber operator. So you don't need to know how to do it. You could just pay for it. And that's effectively what's going on. So these are hackers for hire, people who understand how to do offensive cyber operations, and they are selling those services, hacking as a service. Now, again, this would be illegal. There are legal ways to hack. This is called penetration testing, pen testing, or white hat hacking. That is an organization that is a business that someone can, let's say a bank, could hire the company to hack them, and that's done legally and it's done with their consent. And then they give a report saying, this is how we got into your server. This is how we tricked your bank teller to give us this information, et cetera. Yes, ma'am. Yeah, this is a very, very good question. So the question was about was about how payments are made and whether or not the payment information is going to increase your vulnerability. And a couple things about that. Almost all of these sites are now using cryptocurrency. There are some sites that will use Visa, MasterCard, but they are very, very few and far between. And if anyone's ever going to use that, they're going to go get a cash card that they go get at and carding is actually a thing. So if someone is going to be using a cryptocurrency, they're usually, a lot of times nowadays, they're not even using Bitcoin anymore. They're using Litecoin, or the most privacy focused cryptocurrency is called Monero. And Monero uses something called ring signatures. And effectively it's an encryption technique that I don't think anybody knows how to it basically allows you to focus down onto, it bundles transactions in such a way that you can, at best, you can identify about 12 people. It's got to be one of these 12, but I don't know which one, kind of thing. But anyways, and that's Monero. But how people do it is effectively they will take cash out of an ATM, and then they'll go to Walmart or one of these stores and they will buy Visa gift cards or MasterCard gift cards. So now they've paid cash and they've got a credit card number, but it's not associated with them at all. So they're not paying with their debit card or their credit card to get the card, but they pay cash to get the card. And then they take stacks of those cards that are $50, $100, and then they go on to a cryptocurrency site and they purchase cryptocurrency using that. And now they have a cryptocurrency wallet with money in it that is not tied to them at all. And when I first read about this, I was like, oh, okay, that makes sense, the way to do it. And it was about 2 days after I read the article about that, I was standing at Walgreens, the pharmacy, and there was a woman standing there at the counter with a bag, just a bag full of these gift cards. And I thought, this is carding. This is exactly what's going on right now. But anyways, yeah, interesting. Yeah, that's right. Well, around Christmas, these are, yeah. And, and typically nowadays, these types of operations are being done with cutouts. In other words, a cutout is, we in the intelligence world, it's like, you're not going to go, if I'm the criminal, I'm not going to go get the cards. I'm going to hire you to go get the cards for me. You don't even know, you just know, hey, I get $100 to go to Walgreens and clean them out, whatever. Same thing on the other end. When the drugs show up, that you mail the drugs not to your house, but you mail it to the vacant house down the street. And then you hire somebody to go pick up the package and bring it to you. And so it's all removed, and it's quite involved. And so there's some cool TV shows that show the police, because you catch the courier and then you work, okay, who hired you? And you work your way to the criminal and all that. I love that kind of stuff. So, but yeah. Yes, ma'am. Yeah, so if you use a virtual machine to, it's kind of like almost, even if you use a VPN to get onto Tor, you could do that as well. So if you use a virtual machine, for those of you who are not familiar with a virtual machine, but a virtual machine is a computer within a computer. You're allocating hardware, software, and CPU space for an operating system in its own partitioned area of your computer. And that the browser that's running on that virtual machine does not have to have any relation to the browser running on the parent computer. Now, depends on how the routing is done. So if you're both exiting through the same gateway router, and you're using private IPs behind that same gateway router, then the NAT table, I don't know how familiar you are with networking, but that network address translation table, if you're on the IPv4 system, that could record both of those private IP addresses. So that could give you away. But you're absolutely right that if, let's say you're running IPv6 or you're on an IPv4 and your NAT table is still it's pretty solid and they haven't got into it, that could separate those two IP addresses. You're exactly right. So that would be a good technique using a virtual machine. Yeah, very good. We have 10 minutes. Okay. Yes, sir. Mm-hmm.
So what exactly is going on? Is it that let's say I even clone the rendezvous points IP or something, right? Pretend to be coming from it. I will not succeed. Is it because it's encrypted with that site's, that server
Right.
public key, and therefore what comes through I can't break it?
That's right. That's exactly right. So the only piece of information you're going to be able to get, you can't really do anything with it. Yeah.
Because of the encryption, I can't do much.
Well, it kind of depends on who I am in that scenario. Yeah. So because effectively you're splitting that inference. So the big picture is the nodes that know who you are or who the web server is, they don't know where you're going. They don't know where that rendezvous point is. And the ones that know where the rendezvous point is don't know who's rendezvousing, and the actual packets are encrypted. So they don't really, they don't really know. Yeah. Okay. I was going to show you one more thing. Let's see. I was going to take you to, Vice City has a good CAPTCHA. Yeah, you can buy, there's everything. I mean, you can purchase diplomas, passports, counterfeit money. It's all out there, unfortunately. So for those of us who actually earned our degrees, some people actually go on and fake their way through a degree, unfortunately. But I wanted to show you this because this is an example of one of the CAPTCHAs that you get on the dark web. And you can see this is not an obvious answer, even to a human being, right? So this would be, I think, what it's asking for. Yeah. And so then now you have to log in, so you have to be registered. But that, as you can probably see, that was probably not intuitive, but I've done it a lot, so I can see what it's doing. But it just shows that because they're so worried about those DDoS attacks. I don't want to log into this site, but I'll take you to a drug marketplace just to show you kind of, and this could kind of be the last site. There are a couple more, but I think you get the idea. Let's see. Germany, Finland, and the Czech Republic. Yeah, the question is, can you buy stolen credit card numbers in bulk? And the answer is yes, unfortunately. Yeah. I've had my credit card stolen before too, which is terrible, but. I think they are very, very, they're not very widely used. I mean, because criminality is itself a very minority kind of thing. I mean, most of us probably are here because they've never really seen the dark web. So it can't be that widespread. But I don't know. I don't know the statistics as far as that goes in terms of, but you can imagine the type of people who do go to these for criminal reasons are repeat offenders, unfortunately. Okay, well, this may take too long, but so I guess the big picture takeaway that I wanted to bring us back to is this idea that when we think of the dark web, we think of sites like the ones I'm showing you. And anytime I give a talk on the dark web, I always have to, here we go. I always have to spend more time than I want to on these kinds of sites because a lot of people, that's why they're here. They're interested in these kinds of things. So cocaine is being sold, heroin, et cetera, et cetera. Again, is it illegal to look at this? No. Is it illegal to buy drugs? Absolutely. And we're not going to do that, obviously. But these are kind of things, they get sent directly to people's houses or they get sent to some location. And it's not illegal to receive, cocaine at your door, because otherwise I could put anyone in jail by buying cocaine and sending it to your house and then calling the police. It is illegal to buy drugs. It is illegal to, once you get a thing of cocaine, to not report that to the authorities, right? So talking yourself through that, you always maintain on the right side of ethics and the law, of course. But anyways, here's an example of the Venus Marketplace, one of the many marketplaces that are out there. I'm sorry, the credit cards? Sure. I'll just click on. Where do I? Oh, sorry. Okay. So pay $150 and get $2,500 balance on credit cards is what they're asking, or is what they're saying. So again, these are situations like I have been to a restaurant and have had my credit card stolen, and it's a terrible thing. But the people are making money off doing this, unfortunately. So. But yeah, so, but what I want to do is I want to bring it back and kind of finalize this using something that is far less unsavory. And that is, what constitutes a dark website is context dependent. The BBC, for example, would be a dark website if you are in a country whose government doesn't want you to have access to that information. And so we don't want to overly focus, I think, using an American perspective with our Bill of Rights and the freedoms that we enjoy. And we have to think about things like Tor browsing, anonymous browsing as an empowering ability for people to be able to be exposed to information that perhaps we take for granted. Thank you very much for coming to the talk. And I'll take any additional questions privately up here if you would have any. Thank you.